Good evening and welcome to our very first ever sneak peek summer forum. We're going to talk about the Topaz internment camps tonight. We have a very special guest, Rick Okabe. Rick was born and raised in Chicago, and he lived and worked in San Francisco's Silicon Valley for 14 years before he moved to Salt Lake in 1990. Rick's parents were from Seattle, Washington. They were imprisoned in the, Tule Lake incarceration camp in Northern California, and I hope he'll tell you the story of how his parents got married. After being released, they worked their way to Chicago, where they relocated and raised their family. Rick is a board member of the Topaz Museum, which opened in Delta in 2017. Although he was not interned, in fact, he didn't even know that his parents were interned until he was quite a bit older. He supports the mission of the Topaz Museum to preserve the campsite and tell the story of the Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated there during World War II. And I'm so happy to welcome him here. Rick's going to talk for about 20-30 minutes, and then we're going to have, or longer, and then we're going to pass the plate, take some donations to pay for our facilities here, and the excellent help. Tristan, thank you for being up there. And Tristan's got us on Zoom, so we probably have some people joining us via Zoom. This will be recorded, and the recording will be on our website. So we'll get started then. Thank you, Rick. It's so nice to have you.
Thank you, Colleen. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank you very much for the invitation to speak before you. I will pretty much speak before anybody who's willing to listen about Topaz, because I think it's a very important subject, and one that, frankly, is not mandated to be taught in the history books in the United States, and so that's why a number of people still don't really know what it's all about. As Colleen mentioned, I was born and raised in Chicago, and went to Northwestern to have a degree in business. I worked in Silicon Valley for 14 years, as she said, and I moved here to get married to my wife, and I don't regret that at all, moving to Salt Lake from San Francisco. But I was born after World War II in Chicago. That was after my folks had left the Tule Lake camp and worked their way across to make it to Chicago, where they had a few friends and were able to leave the Tule Lake camp a little bit early, actually quite a bit early, as long as you had a job offer and a reference. You could actually leave the camp as long as you moved away from the West Coast. And so that's what my parents did. As Colleen referenced, they're getting married. They were actually sort of going together in Seattle when the war broke out. The whole family moved to Tule Lake, and then my father, who had a degree in chemistry, got a job offer to analyze pesticides at a apple orchard in Fruitland, Idaho. And he looked at the balance sheet and said, pesticides in Fruitland or prison camp for 3 years. So he picked the pesticides. And my mother said at the time, because they were married, you can't go without me. And so they got married in camp. Somebody made a wedding dress for my mother, and it happened just by chance that one of the government hired photographers, which most of the black and white photographs you'll see here are from the National Archives, because they were taken by photographers, professional photographers, including Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange, who were very famous. But the government restricted these photographers to only take pictures of the people, and generally, even if you're in camp, in a prison camp, when somebody points a camera at you, you smile. So a lot of these pictures, are of people smiling, but they were not allowed to take pictures of the barbed wire and the guard towers and the soldiers. So it's a somewhat biased view of these pictures. That's why we're trying to tell the whole story. But anyway, they did marry in camp, They went to Fruitland, Idaho. They worked their way across to Chicago, and that's the reason I was born and raised in Chicago. If the war had not happened, I probably would have been born in Seattle, Washington. My life would be completely different, and I wouldn't be standing here talking about Topaz. So who knows what would have happened. But because of the experiences of my family, my grandparents, who were first-generation Japanese immigrants, my parents, who were both born in the United States in the Seattle area, a couple of aunts and uncles, and my older cousin, all were in the Tule Lake camp. And my wife's mother, who was originally from Los Angeles, she was in the Hart Mountain camp near Cody, Wyoming. But because of these personal family experiences, of which I knew very little as a kid, because they didn't talk about it very much, because of what I learned as I grew up and went to college and beyond, I felt that it was necessary for me to get involved in the Topaz camp when I moved here. Even though my family wasn't in Topaz, all 10 camps were very similar. They were all made of wooden barracks, and the experiences of the internees were pretty much the same. So that's why I got involved with the Topaz Museum, and I'm very proud that we have a museum that's been open since 2017 in Delta. So the incarceration of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry was a gross denial of constitutional rights. They were held in 10 prison camps across mostly the western United States, although there were 2 in Arkansas. And they were held behind barbed wire for over 3 years, and most of them were. There were no trials. They had no attorneys, there was no due process, and they were never accused or committed or convicted of any act of treason or sabotage. Their only crime was they happened to look like the enemy. The bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 was the event that triggered this mass incarceration of people. And it immediately caused an uncertainty and anxiety along every Japanese-American community up and down the West Coast. Within 4 months of Pearl Harbor, people were starting to be taken away from their homes. These notices went up in every community up and down the West Coast. The majority of the Topaz internees here in Delta came from the San Francisco Bay Area. This is a map of the 10 camps in the big, bold black letters, including Topaz in Utah. And again, there were 2 in even Roar and Jerome in Arkansas. The lighter names, such as Tan Foran, which was in San Bruno, just south of San Francisco, Puyallup, Santa Ana. Most of the ones, those are all on the West Coast. They were fairgrounds, typically fairgrounds or racetracks, where you had a large expanse of open land. They were turned into temporary camps. Some of the horse stalls were converted into barracks because they needed a place to hold 120,000 people before the 10 camps were finished. So they pushed this through this removal very quickly, even though the 10 camps weren't finished. The shaded area is what they called the exclusion zone that the military set up. It said that if you were living anywhere from the actual coast up to 50 or 75 miles inland, you would not be allowed to reside there during the balance of the war. Tan Foran, which was a racetrack, like I said, in San Bruno, California, was the temporary, what the government called the assembly center. But that was the racetrack in San Bruno where the Topaz internees were first held. This is a enlargement of part of the posters that were put up in Japan towns along the West Coast. They eventually stated that you had to be on a street corner in your community on a certain day and a certain time. You could bring only what you could carry, a couple of suitcases, maybe some blankets, anything else that you owned, furniture, housing, business, vehicles, would have to be disposed of. And because the general public knew that they were going to be taken away on a certain date, they were offered maybe 10 cents on the dollar. So you either had to sell at 10 cents on the dollar or leave your things, on the curb. And in a matter of weeks, millions of dollars of property were lost. I've highlighted two sections here on the poster. I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, but basically the government from day one began to use words that would downplay what was actually happening. So for example, the second paragraph starts as all Japanese persons, both alien and non-alien. Okay? So you're trying to identify who has to go into these camps. We still use the term alien to denote somebody who is not a U.S. citizen. So that's fairly clear. If you're an alien, you've got to go in because you're not a citizen. If you're a non-alien, which is the opposite of non-citizen, you must be a citizen in the United States. You must have some constitutional rights that prevent you from being picked up off the street by gunpoint and put in a prison camp for 3.5 years. But this was one way that the government tried to start playing down what was actually happening. Their euphemism is obviously. The second term, which they're calling what's happening to these Japanese persons, they will be evacuated from their homes. Now, evacuation or evacuated typically means the government is taking you away from a possible natural disaster, a hurricane or a flood or an earthquake. For your own safety, you're being moved away from that area. In this case, there was no danger to the residents. The government claimed it was for their safety, but again, it's just to really play down what was actually happening. So this was one of the posters that went up in San Francisco. So on the appointed day, you put your 2 suitcases and some bedding on the sidewalk, and these buses pulled up. You didn't know where you were going. You didn't know how long you'll be there. You didn't know when you'd get back home, if ever. It didn't matter if you were young, small children had to go, and they're all wearing a mandated string paper tag that's got a number on it. So from the very beginning of this process, you were given a number, and that's what you were followed through this process. If you were old and elderly, you had to go. If you were in a hospital, you had to go. And if you had at least 1/16 blood, Japanese blood, you would have to go in. If you had no Japanese blood, but you happened to be married to somebody who was Japanese, you didn't have to go in. But in most cases, the spouses who were not Japanese voluntarily went with their spouse to go into these camps because they didn't want to be separated during the war. And in the government's infinite wisdom, it went into Japanese orphanages in California. I think there were 3 of them. And they pulled out babies such as you see here. They had to set up a special orphanage in the Manzanar, California camp because these are obviously threats to our national security right here. I've got some of these photographs I'm going to talk about were given to me by Grace Oshita. She was one of the founding members of the Topaz board. Unfortunately, she passed away. Well, she was in her late 80s, but she did pass away about 4 or 5 years ago. But She and I used to do these types of talks, and she could give her own personal stories about what she went through. So she allowed me to use some of her photographs in my presentation so I can give a little more personal narration here. So she was a 17-year-old high school student. She's the back row, second from the left. And her family lived in Japantown in San Francisco. Her father, who is not in this picture, ran the largest miso company in California, well, probably most of the United States. Miso is the fermented soybean paste that's used to make miso soup that you get in every Japanese restaurant. You know, for the Japanese Americans and Japanese, miso is the same as chicken soup, you know, for other people. So this is her family, her mother, her grandmother, some nieces, and they're all assembled on the day that they are supposed to be taken away, dressed in their Sunday best, trying to smile for the camera, even though they don't know where they're going or what's going to happen to them and what's going to be back, you know, at their homes when they come back. They were taken to, like I mentioned, Tanforan Assembly Center. There were horse stalls still standing in Tanforan, so they used some of them. They whitewashed them, they rinsed them out, but put in a couple of army cots, and that's where some of the people going to Topaz had to live for the first 6 months. It was not pretty. After the end of the 6 months, when Topaz was pretty much finished, they were put on trains in Oakland for, I think it was about a 2.5 or 3 day trip to Delta, Utah, which was the closest train station to where the camp was located. The actual campsite is 17 miles outside of Delta. Now, Delta's a town of 2,500 people. It's got one stoplight. So 17 miles outside of town of Delta, there's pretty much nothing there, particularly in the location of the camp. It's part of the Sevier Desert. And so they were pretty far removed from anything. Grace remembers being on this train and having the soldiers tell them to pull the shades down whenever the train went through a small town. And she didn't know if that meant they didn't want the internees to know where they were, or they didn't want the townspeople to look inside and see all of these Japanese Americans being taken away. Once they got to the train station in Delta, all their belongings were put on trucks, they were put on buses, took the 17-mile trip to the actual campsite. And when they got there, there was a regular intake process, which included a medical exam, filling out some forms, and being fingerprinted and photographed. To me, this looks pretty much like a booking process, right? Again, not just simple, innocent U.S. citizens going out to summer camp. They were also issued these War Relocation ID cards, so you, again, had a number stamped on it, and you, to the government, you became just a number. The actual living area of the camp was about 1 square mile. It was surrounded by barbed wire, and it had wooden guard towers on the corners and in the middles of the fences that were manned by soldiers with searchlights and rifles. In addition to this 1 square mile, the government took over 19,000 additional acres surrounding the campsite so that they could grow food, vegetables, basically, some grains. They had a chicken farm for eggs. They had cows for milk for the kids. So it had to be a self-containing small city of about 8,000 people at one time. This is one of the 42 blocks that made up this whole campsite. So each of these, the 1 square mile was divided into 42 what they call residential blocks. These barracks are pretty much a standard Army barrack design, very simple, not insulated. Each building, there were 10 buildings that had about 6 one-room apartments in them. They called them apartments. And then there were 3 buildings in the center, a mess hall, a laundry, and a shower and latrines. So this is how it was organized in terms of you got a block number, a barrack number, and then an individual unit number to identify where you were living. We don't have a lot of photographs from the interiors of these barracks, so some of the things we picked up are sketches. This happened to be sketched by the wife of a CAF staff member. And so it does show a family of 5, a mother, a father, and 3 kids in a one-room, 20 by 20 unit. All it had in it was 1 electric light bulb hanging from the ceiling and 1 coal-fired pot-bellied stove for heat during the wintertime. There was no running water, no washrooms, no kitchen. That's where you lived for 3 years. The furniture, all that was furnished were the Army cots that you slept in. Everything else was made from either scraps of wood that you could scrounge from the left over from building the camps themselves, or things that you could just find while roaming around. And you could see that the father's sitting on a suitcase and using a barrel as a little table. So you really had to figure out and be ingenious about how you furnished your, quote, apartment. Here's a painting done by one of the actual artists who came to Topaz, and I've got a little story about that too, but this gives you an example of mothers bathing their babies in the laundry room tubs. This artist was Hisako Hibi. She was a professional artist living in the San Francisco Bay Area. There was another artist, Chiro Obata, who was a professor at UC Berkeley of art before the war. He was well known even at that time, and he was also well known for his paintings of the Yosemite area in California. Professor Obata came to Topaz and said, with all these people that have nothing to do in camp, I'm going to start an art school. Let's give them something to do, give them a way to express some of their emotions of what they're going through. And so Topaz had one of the largest art schools of the 10 camps. At one point, there were about 700 or 800 students. And I am aware that the museum on the U's campus, they had an exhibit several years ago of Professor Obata's works, and they've acquired a few of his paintings. And aren't you going to have somebody talking about those?
Yes.
July
10th.
July 10th. So come back for Topaz Part 2. Grace Oshta remembers, had told me about some very distinctive memories she had of being in these camps. One was the lines. Again, you didn't have any facilities of any kind within your unit. So in order to have your 3 meals a day, you got in line. And early on, you actually had to take your own plates and utensils into the mess hall. Later on, they acquired more and more of the Army surplus kind of stuff. But she remembers standing in line. And she stood in line for meals. You stood in line for taking showers, going to the bathroom. They had a small co-op store. Everyone wanted to buy had something favorite they wanted to buy from the Call Star if they could get it. So they all stood in line for that. She also remembered this. You can see the building behind her, the line here. All the barracks were built very hastily with just 2x4 studs and planks going across the outside. There was no insulation. There was no soundproofing. There was no caulking between the boards. And out in the severe desert, there's a very fine alkaline dust on the ground. And the wind would blow, and this fine dust would get into the units every day. And Gracie remembers her job being to take the broom and sweep out all the fine dust that would accumulate in their unit. And this is not a Topaz mess hall, but I'm sure they were all the same because, but you ended up sitting in this kind of a situation. And what happened here was parents eventually got kind of worried because their kids typically would want to go eat with their friends, down at the other end. And so they would leave their parents and go sit with their friends. And it concerned some of the parents about how they were losing control and losing the family unit. So there were influences that happened that would not be readily observable or really, you wouldn't realize it until somebody actually explained these things to you, how your life changed in the camp. This is Grace. She's second from the left, with a friend of hers, and her friend's brother is the one in uniform. And let me back up a little bit. After about a year, I think it was, the war is still going on. The government is still looking for volunteers to join the army because of the war that's in both the Pacific and in Europe. And so they decided to open up for volunteers in the 10 camps. This was a rather controversial policy. It tended to break down the eligible young men into two groups. The first group said, yes, I'm going to volunteer. I'm going to show every American citizen that I am just as good as they are, I am just as loyal as they are, and I'm willing to give my life in defense of this country. That was the one group, and the government took them happily. The other group said, hell no, I won't go. Why should I go defending this country that's put me and my family behind barbed wire? And that caused fights in some of the camps. There were very, very heated discussions and fights about this issue. Each group calling the other, disloyal or whatever you want. And it didn't heal until many years after the war was over. There have been workshops and conventions and other things that have been going on, because frankly, most of the actual young men who were involved have passed on, but that was passed down to their kids, and those feelings of butting heads on who's right and who's wrong in this kind of situation was very unfortunate. You also had the situation of Gold Star mothers having to grieve for their sons who were killed in the war. It's estimated that about 800 Japanese Americans did die in the war. They were also known as one of the most, they did fight and in a very, very determined, loyal, significant manner. They did feel they had to prove something. to the country. That in spite of their families being put in camps, they were still maybe more loyal, or that's what they were trying to prove. And so they also, sorry, I'm a little bit out of order on this one. They were put in segregated units within the Army, one being the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought in Europe and was one of the most highly decorated units. It suffered very high casualties, but it was one of the most highly decorated units in the entire war. So at the end of the war, October 1945, there was no longer a need to keep Japanese Americans behind barbed wire. So they were starting to close the camps. They gave the internees a train ticket back to a one-way ticket back to wherever they wanted to go, and that was it. They were on their own. This was very difficult for them going back because they hadn't been home in 3.5 years. And even though they had not been charged with any crimes, they were met with a lot of hostility and prejudice when they got back home. In many cases, they may have left property or housing or farms with neighbors or something like that, and they found that those neighbors figured they weren't coming back, so they either took them over or they resold them, and they lost, more of their property. Once they left, they lost property in value. And once they got back, they found out they also lost on that end too. And it took a long time for them to find jobs, find housing, and work to become accepted back into the communities. And I have to say that as a third generation Japanese, again, the first generation was my grandparents, the immigrants. Second generation was my parents who were born in the United States. They were my parents basically were the ones, and all of the Japanese in that age range were the ones that came back, found jobs, found housing wherever they had to. And in fact, I was born on the south side of Chicago in the middle of all black neighborhood, because that's the only place my parents were allowed to rent when they first got there, and to Chicago. So in basically two generations, my parents and mine, today, I feel I can honestly say that, I don't believe I've ever been discriminated because of how I look for a job or for an apartment or just talking to people. I do remember as a young college student, I was at some sort of reception, and I was just talking to this gentleman I'd never met before, and all of a sudden he says, I was in Japan last year, and I just loved being in your country. Okay, so that was the first time I realized that I stick out because of how I look, and people make assumptions about that about me, right? And that's the one thing that gets this country into trouble a lot of times, because that's how everybody looks at it. It's a natural thing to do, but it's not the best thing to do, because you can't tell the character and about a person just by looking at them. You've got to talk to them a while, to get to know them and to get to find out that most people are pretty decent, good human beings. But anyway. Okay, this is part of the returning internees. Again, Nisei is the second generation. My parents, that's the name we call that second generation. But there are protests in Seattle, Washington, because, again, they had suspicions about why the government would have put them in these prison camps if they hadn't done something wrong. But within basically one generation, my parents' generation, they were able to allow me to have the opportunities I have because of what they went through. Now, if you go out to the site today at Topaz, this is what you see. Not real inviting. You can see the alkaline dust on the floor of the desert. Greasewood is all over, blows through and the wind still blows the dirt around. But it doesn't look like much. But this is an actual part of this is within the barbed wire fencing. This is a part of the campsite. But if you go to Google Maps and Google Topaz Camp, this is what you see. You can still see the outlines of the 42 living blocks. You can still see they're not really roads, they're usually dirt and gravel. They were used for supplies in and out, but there were not a lot of vehicles traveling through here. At the very top is the main entrance in the center, and squares for, there was a hospital, there were some warehousing for supplies, and there were living quarters for the military police. There's a big 4-square empty area in the center of the camp that did not have a living barracks, that contained ball fields, baseball fields. There was a high school with some other types of recreational facilities, but that's the camp. It's still out there. Jane Beckwith, who's our founder and president, who lives in Delta, who founded the Topaz Museum, said once she had a couple of Delta airline pilots come down to visit her because they fly the route over the campsite and looked down and seen this pattern, and he couldn't figure out what it was there. So that interested him enough to go down and see what was out there. So over the last 30 years or so that the board has been in existence, we have raised enough money to buy this entire site. And so we feel, so particularly the internees or the descendants of former internees, consider this to be hallowed ground. You know, it's something that has impacted almost every Japanese American in the country today. We are, the fact that the camps have never been a real big subject that's taught in school. It's never been a big for general, it's never been a big, we need to rally around and have big discussions or programs or whatever. It's not like it's got anywhere near the understanding as Pearl Harbor does. You know, every school kid knows December 7th. So we feel it's really important to maintain that site. And in 2007, it became a National Historic Landmark. It's one of only 13 National Historic Landmarks in Utah. And so we have this plaque mounted out at the site. And then if you walk around, there's actually remnants of the original barbed wire. It's not too imposing. It's probably barely 6 feet tall, but it's in the middle of a desert. So even if you crawled into the fence, which some kids did apparently to collect shells and rocks and things, there was no place to go. The other photograph is a photograph of what's left of the footings for a guard tower. If you look a little closer around the ground, you can see a number of clues here. The line of rocks, people would line up rocks as sort of pointing the way to the front door of their barrack. There's a pair of soles of shoes. They've been sitting there for 70 years. Pieces of Japanese rice bowl. Toys, bent toys. I've seen nail polish jars with the brush still in the jar. So it basically gives you evidence of what was, during the war, the 9th largest city in Utah. I'm sorry, the 5th largest city in Utah. Okay, then in the 80s, long after the war, the government authorized a commission on wartime, here it is, again, another word, relocation, they're calling it, even back in the 80s. And where they took a testimony from former internees across the country. It took them a year to go to about 15 cities, I think, collect personal testimonies of former internees and do other research about the camps. And after the year-long hearings were done, they wrote a report. And basically, they concluded that, one, no documented evidence of espionage or sabotage. The Japanese were never dangerous or never a threat. There was no direct military necessity for the incarceration. And three, the actions of the government were caused by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So because of this, this was the first time that this kind of conclusions have been stated by the federal government itself, the ones that put us into, put my families into camp originally. And as a result, Congress voted to apologize formally for what they had been done. So every surviving internee got a personal, not a personal, but a letter from the first President Bush apologizing for what had been done, for the rights that had been taken away. And to me, this is pretty significant because the government doesn't apologize very often. Even when it knows it's wrong, it doesn't apologize very often. So that was significant. They also received a redress check of $25,000. And yeah, that's a chunk of change, but it certainly can't compensate you for 3.5 years in prison camp. And so, but the fact that they were able to pass a bill that authorized $25,000 per person, and I think the total amount was something a little less than $1 billion or something like that. But it did seem to prove or to signify that the government was serious about this. And they did feel that some compensation had to be made for what had happened. Am I running out of time? Okay. Let me just recap and go over one more thing. 120,000 innocent people were incarcerated for 3.5 years. They had no attorneys, no trials, and no crimes. So how did this happen? Well, it really, I said in the beginning that it was triggered by Pearl Harbor, but that's not the primary reason that it happened. There had been prejudice and discrimination against the Japanese in the United States for over 70 years prior to World War II. And frankly, this isn't uncommon. This isn't unlike almost every other immigrant group that came from someplace else because they heard that the United States was the land of plenty. It gave everybody a fair chance. You had democracy, a right to vote, a right to make a good living for you and your family. That's what's driven immigrants here from day one. So the Japanese were not any different. However, and here are some of the things that happened to the Japanese. In 1870, there was a Naturalization Act passed. It gave immigrants from Africa the right to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. But it specifically denied that same right to immigrants from Japan. My last statement, that the immigrants from Japan were classified as aliens. The alien goes back to the poster. Even today, we call immigrants who are not U.S. citizens aliens. Think about that term. That's the term we use to talk about things from outer space. Things so exotic, so different from us, they couldn't possibly become real U.S. citizens. So even still to today, we're still trying to label people and start thinking about people in a certain way, which should not be done, because that's why I think race relations are not getting better faster. And then here's a California Alien Land Law of 1913, which prohibited aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning agricultural land. Well, first of all, this was really pushed by the farmers in California. You've got aliens ineligible for citizenship. That means the Japanese, because that's the law that prevented them from coming here in the first place. And it forced some of the Japanese. What happened was the first generation immigrants from Japan, they came from Japan. One of the basic skills they had was farming. But in Japan, it's a very small country, a lot of mountains, not a lot of flat, arable land. They developed their own labor-intensive techniques on how to make that land productive and how to get more produce per acre. And so they brought those skills and the willing to do the extra hand labor to the United States, to California. They started to have success. They started to save a little money. They started to buy up a little bit of land on their own. As soon as that happened, the big farmers, California farmers said, oh, they're taking away our jobs. So that's why they passed this law in California. So that was the Alien Land Law of 1913. And then 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924, this prohibited Japanese from entering the United States until 1952. So it wasn't until well after the war was over that any more immigrants could come from Japan. Now, it turned out that after the war, with all the help that Japan got to recover from the devastation of the war, they turned into the electronics boom and all the success they had. There were from that point on, the 50s and 60s, I guess probably the 60s and 70s, from that point on, people were doing so well in Japan, they saw no need to immigrate to the United States. So that's why you don't see as large a population of Japanese in various areas around the country. There's no need for them to come and make a new life here because they're doing pretty good in Japan. But it's the Southeast Asians, the Thai, some areas of China, Taiwanese. Those are the Southeast Asians are the ones that are coming because they still are having troubles in their hometown, in their home countries. And it's again, that's the driving force of most immigrant first-generation stories. So this is the Topaz Museum in Delta. How many people have been there? Anybody? Oh, wow, great. Thank you very much for going down there. It's not easy. I know it is not easy. It's about a 2.5-hour drive, and it's off of I-15, probably 45 minutes to an hour. But we think it's worth the drive. We've got professionally designed exhibits, model of the campsite. We've got original suitcases that were on the San Francisco streets when they went to Tanforan, and now they've been saved all these years. And what happens is that Jane, whenever a former internee comes to Topaz, she will drop everything she's doing, and if they can remember their barrack number and their building number, she can take them out to the exact location of where that person's or that person's family was housed. And so they go back home. They're so indebted to Jane for giving them that insight into what the family went through. They go through their garages and their attics, and they start shipping us stuff that's been sitting there because it was saved by the original internees because of what they went through. It was a traumatic experience, and for some reason there's an emotional attachment to these things. But now that they're passing on, their descendants are saying, well, we don't really need these, so they end up in our museum. But we're glad to have them. There's a wedding dress that somebody made, and a baby's crib. And finally, we also have, after the war, all of the buildings that you saw out of the site were either torn down or sold. Some houses in Delta were built around an original barracks. And Jane says she can recognize them by the placement of the windows and the doors. One of them was half of a recreation hall was used as a storage shed for a local farmer. He donated it to us. We refurbished it, so it's sitting behind the museum. So there are interesting things to see when you go to Topaz if you can get there. Ask for Jane Beckworth. She'll tell you anything you want to know. She knows more Japanese Americans than I do. And she lives in a town where none of them live there. They all come to visit. So that's my story. I hope this gives you some insights into what really happened at Topaz and why it's important, why we feel it's important, while the state of Utah thinks it's important because they gave us a generous donation to help build this museum. It's part of our history. We don't want to see it just brushed under the rug. It's not something to celebrate, but it's something to hopefully learn about and help to make sure it doesn't happen again. Thank you.
So if any of you have any questions, just raise your hand. I know I wanted to ask Rick about one of your first slides showed people getting on the bus, and it showed just piles of things that were wrapped on the curbside. Is that what they were leaving?
No, that was going to be picked up by trucks. That's what's going with them. That's two suitcases.
Oh, I'm going to have you come back up here to the mic.
Anyway, if you remember the street of San Francisco, there were, on the sidewalks, there were buses in the street. On the sidewalks, there were piles of baggage and like blankets and sheets and that sort of thing. The rule was, it was whatever you can carry. That's as much you're going to be able to take to the camp. Okay, so it was typically a couple of suitcases and some bedding. And there would be trucks coming by to pick those up to follow the buses into whichever camp you were going.
Okay. Anyone else have a question?
Well, I thought I knew a lot, but I didn't know a lot about this. So was there any rebellion at all by the Japanese people that were sent to these camps? Do you know?
No, not, you mean before?
I mean, when they were being
Refusing
sent, were there people who said, no, this isn't right, I'm not going to do it?
There were,
Violence?
not violence so much as there were a few people who refused to go. They were picked up by the FBI eventually and put in jail and then ended up in a camp someplace. Several of them took cases to the Supreme Court. And initially, they were all denied. The cases, it wasn't until the 1980s that some third-generation lawyers in California, along with Roger Daniels, I can't remember his name, he was a lawyer too, they pro bono took those cases to the Supreme Court, and in the process discovered materials in the archives that showed that the government knew that the FBI and other security organizations had not discovered any evidence that would cause a conviction of anybody of being accused of being a traitor or a saboteur or committing any crime. And so there was very little. It's partly, I've always surmised that it's in the Japanese culture, going back to Japan, there is a tendency not to protest, not to make yourself, put yourself in front of something that's this big and this serious. They sort of hunker down, keep your mouth shut, and we'll get through this. And that sort of internal strength is channeled, so somehow they stuff most of the bad stuff and just move step by step forward. I took, in the 70s, it must have been, I was early 90s. Anyway, my family had a family reunion here in Utah. I had 5 young nephews in grammar school. Went down to Topaz, gave them the story of what their grandparents went through during the war and how unfair it was. And while I'm telling my nephews this, my mother and my aunt, her sister, start to cry. In the car on the way back up here to Salt Lake City, my mother admitted to me that in 50 years since the war ended, she never cried about what she went through. All of that emotion was stuffed. We come from a long line of stuffers in my family. And so, there was some emotional damage done there, but that strength, that's the only way they knew how to get through this, because they went through a lot.
Thank you.
Rick, I really enjoyed your presentation. Just a comment, I grew up in a little town just across the Snake River from Fruitland, Idaho.
Oh, really?
Ontario, Oregon. And my neighbor growing up was a Japanese family. Paul Nakamura was my age, and he was in the internment camp with his family. And so it's just fascinating to get some of the depth that you've presented here about that. It was, anyway, just an amazing experience. Thank you.
Tristan, were there any questions from Zoom?
Not yet.
Okay.
Thank you. Rick, I have two questions. The first is the California proposition, I believe, passed. Was there any, when was that removed? When was it taken away? When was it rescinded?
The alien land law?
Yeah. And was there any compensation for that?
I don't believe there was any I don't know exactly when that was rescinded. And I don't know about the compensation. I do know that some of the ESA, the first generation, got around that by putting the land in their kids' names, because they were kids. Their kids were born in the United States, so they were given their names were put on the property deeds.
So there was no apology from the state of California?
Not that I know of. There may have been, but I'm not aware of it.
Okay. I was born in Idaho in the Minidoka County, and I've never heard of the internment camp up there until I came here just a few years ago. In the Topaz Museum, are there descriptions of the other camps there that
Not
maybe some
really.
pictures or?
We may have a map like I had that shows the 10 camps, but every camp now has some sort of volunteer organization associated with it, either preservation or, in some cases, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, near Cody, Wyoming, has a very thriving museum and very active board. They were including the former Senator Alan Simpson and former cabinet member Norman Mineta. There's a story of those two. Norman Mineta was a young boy. They had a Boy Scout troop in the Cody, Wyoming camp, and Alan Simpson, the senator at that time, was a young boy, and the Boy Scouts, the Cody, Wyoming Boy Scouts, they met in camp on some projects. Both of them ended up being politicians in Washington, D.C. They became lifelong friends, and they helped publicize and support the museum that's now in the Heart Mountain, Wyoming campsite. And unfortunately, Mr. Mineta passed away not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, I believe. But that's a famous story in our community.
I'm curious about what kind of what the school system was like, or not system, but what kind of education system was set up for the young people, and did the families have to teach, and did they have teachers come in, or?
They had both. There were lots of kids in camp. They had daycare. They had, I think, a grammar school up to about, I don't know for sure all the grades, but they did have organized classrooms. Some of the teachers in the elementary classes were already teachers, from California that came into camp as internees. They did some of the teaching. There were local people around Delta who volunteered their time to be teachers. And then Grace said, some high school students, if they were mature enough, they ended up being teachers too. So there was an attempt to try to formalize classes, because they didn't want their kids to be too far behind, 3 years behind, by the time they got back home. So there was somewhat of an organized school system.
So what did the folks in the community where these people were taken from, Were they generally supportive of this thing, or did any of the communities go, this isn't a good idea, this is my neighbor, I know him?
Very few
Very
of
few
the
people stood up,
communities
but they were enabling it?
Again, depending on how close you were to a family, if you were next door to a Japanese family and you guys were best friends, they would know that this was not right. But there weren't enough people like that. In many cases, there were most of these people were living in Japantowns originally because that's where they were most comfortable, right? Again, it's an immigrant group. You come with people who speak the same language. You open up restaurants for Japanese food or a fish market, and you congregate into Japantown. We used to have a Japantown on First South, which got destroyed when they put in the convention center. So, no, I lost what did I say? Sorry.
It's all right. It sounds like there wasn't a big upswell of outrage.
There was not. There was one or two ACLU chapters that tried to help, but there was not a big groundswell for anywhere in the country that said, no, you can't do this. There was no uprising of Japanese residents who said, I'm not going to go, drag me out, I'm going to sit out here until you drag me out. There was not much of this because, one, that wasn't in their nature, but two, at the time, World War II was already going on, and they didn't have the kind of political and economic clout, and also not the same ties to other groups who might think in similar ways. They didn't have all those things that you might have now that would hopefully today would not let that happen again.
Were they allowed to communicate with friends or family in other internment camps?
You could write letters.
US mail? Okay.
You could write. In fact, I don't think I.
Were they allowed to see media from what was going on in the war?
I don't know. I don't know that. I'm assuming they may have had access to newspapers, but I don't know that there was anything really formalized other than that.
But no telephones?
No telephones. They didn't have cell phones, certainly, and they did not have telephone in those barracks.
Hey, thank you for everything you said. I really appreciate that. I had two questions. One is, as being a fairly isolated group during that time, was there a lot of sickness that went through, or was everything pretty level? You mentioned that there was a hospital there when at some point. And my second question is, I think that all of us could probably agree that the most atrocious things that any of our government has ever done have all been some sort of discrimination on one sort of or another. But how is this, knowing your history, has it changed how you think of the government and that sort of thing?
I suppose I'm kind of cynical about the government, in this day and age. Certainly the last administration, I'm very, very, very upset with that. But I think in general, the government, like I think I mentioned, doesn't apologize very often. We had a recession, I don't know, what was it, 8 years ago, 9 years ago? I mean, I lost a lot of money in my IRA. Nobody apologized for that. It's sort of in the nature of a big bureaucracy to cover those things up and just move on. But this, what we're talking about is a basic constitutional right of not being accused, not being punished for a crime that you didn't commit, and that the government admitted they didn't commit. So, on the other hand, my wife used to work for the government, so I can't be Although she didn't work for the federal government, she worked for the state government and the county government, so,
I actually have a question.
yes.
Of course, it's hideous racism, but can you speak also about the financial motive? I mean, you mentioned that Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans had achieved a pretty good financial status and were beginning to own land and start businesses, and then suddenly, boom, they're in an internment camp.
At the time of the war, were just starting to do that. They had not reached a level where I could say that they had a very large amount of financial power at that point in time. But before they could get there, the farmers, existing California farmers, passed that law because they could see it coming. They didn't want them to be overrun by Japanese from Japan who could farm better than they could, and be more productive. So it wasn't until after the war. It was probably, the war ended in 1945, so it probably took 10 to 15 years for most of the returning families, my parents' age, to get settled, find a place to stay, maybe buy a house, and have a decent job to raise kids. And my parents got out of the camp early. They went to Tule Lake. They got out less than a year. They were in Tule Lake. And then they went to Fruitland, Idaho, and then they ended up in Chicago where I was born. And my parents put me and my two sisters through college, by starting from scratch and sometime in the 50s. And I've always admired them for that. Yes.
Zoom is asking, how did they determine the percentage of Japanese that someone had in order to put them in the camps?
I'm sure it was just tracing back, who's your grandparents and who's your great-grandparents and that sort of thing. I would assume. I don't know for sure. I've never heard anything about that. I just remember reading this statistic, and I don't know who came up with the statistic, but I keep quoting it.
There was no 23andMe.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, just my mother-in-law actually was a child in California at this time, and I know she was haunted the rest of her life by this. And I was kind of curious, was there much of a backlash? Was there any group of people who did stand forth and try to support the Japanese, or maybe help hold their homes or things for them, or reach out to them in this time of need? Because I know my mother-in-law, she donated to the Topaz Museum her whole life once it was there, and she was always haunted. They had a Japanese gardener. She had friends that were Japanese. So I'm sure there were a lot of people that were emotionally impacted by this as well that were concerned.
I'm sorry, I keep losing my train of thought. Tell me again what you're asking.
Well, just if there were any groups of people that did get together, or any people who did actually help out, help hold the people's belongings or things that way.
It was a case-by-case basis, a personal basis. If you were neighbors, had been neighbors for 10 or 15 years, and you knew each other, they usually came out okay. If you were in a hurry and you were picking somebody you didn't know from down the street, it would not be unusual for you to come back and find, it's long gone. There were no organized groups other than the government had set up some warehouses that allowed people to bring in belongings, again, suitcases or boxes that were identified and put in warehouses. People coming back to those warehouses found that most of them had been broken into and their stuff was taken. But that wasn't an organized by the local residents. That was the government trying to do something. So there were not any big organizations. There were not any big churches or big civic groups or whatever that would want to stand up during a time of war, and basically they would be looking at saying, they could be accused of trying to help the enemy. Right? They look at me, who looks Japanese, even though I was born and raised in the United States. They look at you and say, you're Japanese, so you must have sympathies to Japan and the emperor. You may be helping to guide a submarine into, land on the beach in California or something. So I think it would be very risky to be publicly supporting Japanese Americans, even though they are Americans, even though my mother had never been to Japan. She spoke Japanese because her parents spoke Japanese, but she'd never been to Japan. She had no intention of supporting the Japanese government. So, yeah, there weren't, unfortunately, there's not any that I can think of, any instances that I can think of that says, here's a group, other than the ACLU through the courts, did support a few causes and a couple of the cases that went up to the Supreme Court.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you so much, Rick.
You're
This
welcome.
was so interesting and informative. I just really appreciate you. And I have a little gift for you.
Okay, and if anybody wants to visit the museum, I got a one-page handout, or it's just got a brief outline of Topaz and what happened, but it's got the contact information and the website of the museum. I've also got some personal business cards that give my home address and home phone number. I will give this talk to anybody who's willing to listen. If you've got an organization you might want to have me come and speak, I'll be glad to do it.
That should be part of all the high school history classes.
It should be, but it's not.
Yes.
I've been to some high school
Have
classes,
you?
but not a lot.
Good. I just wanted to mention that summer forum actually begins Sunday, June 19th. If I got that right? Yep. And this is just a sneak peek. Summer forum will be at 10 o'clock in the morning on Sundays through the summer. And there are many wonderful topics. Darlene ran off a bunch of flyers for us, so you can have one for your fridge. And on July 10th, Rick mentioned the artist Obata, whose family donated 35 works of art to the museum, the University Museum of Fine Arts. And the curator, Luke Kelly, will be here to show us that art, talk about the art school, and tell us more about how productive these people were in this really terrible situation of incarceration and all the things they accomplished there. So I think that'll be a very interesting forum.
One of the things about the artwork done by the internees in Topaz, I mentioned the black and white photographs were taken by professional photographers hired by the government, so they couldn't take pictures of, things that they didn't want to take pictures of. But in some cases, the artists painted things from their perspectives as an internee, from their perspective, not without having the government impose on what they could and could not paint. Mr. Obata probably doesn't have anything really controversial. There's a couple of artists who have done that, but it's still an interesting story of how he just wanted to give people something to do to take their mind off of where they were, and it blossomed. And so there's lots of art out there, and we've got a nice collection of probably over 100 paintings and photographs down at the museum. So.
That's wonderful. I know there are a lot of paintings of dust storms that are very interesting, but can you imagine living through them? Yeah. So, and I want to thank Mark. Mark actually donated this to our congregation, this screen, so that we can have some technology in here and have some beautiful presentations like we had tonight. So thank you, Mark. Let's give him a hand. And Lucy Hauser and Darlene have helped me put this together, and I appreciate their help. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you'll join us. Gene Mahalko's in there. He made a pot of coffee, a pot of decaf. We have tea, we have ice water, and we have homemade cookies. Plus all of you, that we can go in there and chat. So thank you for coming.